The stagecoach rattled into Copper Creek under a sun the color of rust. It was a merciless sun, one that baked the very air and seemed to draw the life from everything it touched. Eleanor Vance felt its heat through the thin fabric of her dress, a dampness clinging to her skin that had nothing to do with the gentle perspiration of the East, and everything to do with a fine layer of grit that had settled over her during the final leg of the journey. Dust was the first and last thing you noticed about this place. It was in the air, on the unpainted planks of the buildings, and it rose in phantom clouds with every footstep and every turn of a wagon wheel. It coated her tongue and stung her eyes. She stepped down onto the hard-packed earth of the main street, her legs unsteady after so many hours of being jostled. The town was not much more than this one street, a collection of tired-looking structures huddled together as if for comfort against the vast, empty prairie that stretched to an endless horizon on all sides. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith's forge sending up lazy plumes of smoke, and a few other buildings whose purposes were not immediately clear. It was a place built of necessity, not beauty. The wind, a constant and mournful companion on the plains, whipped a loose strand of her brown hair across her face, and she pushed it back with a gloved hand, her gaze sweeping over her new home with a feeling that hovered somewhere between terror and a grim sort of resolve. She clutched her satchel tighter. Inside, her father's Bible rested beside her teaching certificate and the letter from the town council offering her the position. The letter had been brief, the handwriting functional, but it had represented a chance. After her father, the minister, had passed, leaving her with little more than his good name and a deep-seated sense of duty. This job in a Texas town she could not even find on a proper map had seemed like providence. Now, standing in the heart of it, it felt more like a test. Loneliness was an old acquaintance, but here it felt different. It was larger, as vast as the sky above her. In the East, loneliness was the quiet of an empty house. Here, it was the roaring silence of the open land. She was an island, a small, solitary figure in a sea of brown grass and unrelenting sunlight. Her instructions were to find the Silver Spur boarding house, run by a woman named Jenkins. Eleanor asked for directions from the stagecoach driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles and sun damage. He pointed a leather-clad thumb down the street. It was the largest building, he said, 2 stories of weary timber that had long ago surrendered its paint to the elements. She walked, her city-bred shoes feeling flimsy and foolish on the uneven ground. Men tipped their hats as she passed, their eyes lingering with a frank curiosity that made her cheeks burn. They were a different breed of men from the one she knew. Their faces were weathered, their hands calloused, their bodies lean and hard from lives spent under the open sky. They watched her as if she were a strange and exotic bird blown far off course. In her dark, modest traveling dress, buttoned to the throat despite the heat, she knew she was exactly that. The Silver Spur boarding house looked as tired as the rest of the town. A wooden sign, the words faded and chipped, creaked on its hinges in the wind. She pushed open the heavy door and stepped into a dim, cool interior that smelled of stale coffee, bacon grease, and old wood. A woman with a face like a dried apple and hair the color of iron filings looked up from behind a long wooden counter. This had to be Mrs. Jenkins. The woman's eyes, small and sharp, took in Eleanor's appearance from head to toe. The assessment was swift and, Eleanor felt, not entirely favorable. Eleanor cleared her throat, the dust still thick in it. She introduced herself as the new schoolteacher, Eleanor Vance. Mrs. Jenkins grunted, a sound that was neither welcoming nor unwelcoming. It was simply a sound of acknowledgement. She pushed a ledger across the counter. Eleanor signed her name, her penmanship a stark contrast of delicate loops and curls against the book's smudged and utilitarian pages. The room, she was told, was number 7, upstairs, second door on the left. The key was a heavy piece of iron that felt cold and solid in her palm, lugging her single, heavy trunk up the narrow, creaking staircase was a trial. The air in the hallway upstairs was thick and still. A long, threadbare runner stretched down the center of the floor, its pattern worn away to nothing in the middle. The light was poor, filtering in from a single dirty window at the far end of the hall. She found what she thought was her door. The number was a small, tarnished brass plate. The 7 was crooked, and a screw was missing, making it look more like a 1. Or perhaps it was a 1. It was hard to tell in the gloom. The nameplate beside it was equally obscured. A slip of yellowed paper slid into a metal holder. The ink faded to a brownish ghost. She could not make out the name at all. But it was the second door on the left, just as she had been told. Exhaustion was a heavy blanket on her shoulders, and all she wanted was to close a door on this town and be alone with her own thoughts. She slid the key into the lock. It resisted, then turned with a loud, grating clank. The sound echoed in the quiet hall. Eleanor pushed the door open and stepped inside, dragging her trunk behind her. The room was not what she expected. It was larger than she would have thought, and starkly masculine. A heavy wooden bedstead, unmade, dominated one wall. A pair of worn leather boots stood near a simple washstand, caked with dry mud. A gun belt, its holster holding a formidable-looking pistol, was slung over the back of a chair. The air smelled of horse, leather, and something else. Something uniquely male and faintly of whiskey. This was not the neat, modest room she had pictured. It was not a room for a lady. A cold dread washed over her. She had made a mistake, a terrible, mortifying mistake. She turned to leave, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But it was too late. The man had come in from a connecting door, one she had not even noticed, a towel in his hands, his hair damp. He was wiping the dust and sweat of a long day from his face and neck. He was tall, broader in the shoulder than she had imagined any man could be. His shirt was unbuttoned halfway down his chest, revealing dark hair and sun-browned skin. His sleeves were rolled up, showing powerful forearms. He stopped dead when he saw her, his hands stilling. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They simply stared. Eleanor felt frozen, a statue of pure, unadulterated panic. Her mind went completely blank. Every rule of etiquette, every lesson in composure she had ever learned, evaporated in the face of this silent, half-dressed stranger in whose room she was an intruder. His eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue in his tanned face, moved from her wide, frightened face to the trunk she had foolishly dragged in with her. He was not angry. He did not look surprised. He looked amused. He slowly lowered the towel, his gaze returning to hers. His face was hard, carved by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke of long hours spent staring into the distance. It was not a handsome face in the classical sense she was used to, but it was strong, and there was a story in it, a past. He was Luke Callahan, a man who owned a small cattle ranch on the edge of town, a man who kept to himself and carried the quiet weight of a grief the town only whispered about. He had a reputation for being tough and not much of a talker, a man who had seen the worst of the war and come out the other side harder than forged steel. He had just spent 10 hours in the saddle, pushing a stubborn stray back from the far pastures, and had been looking forward to a quiet evening with a bottle and his own thoughts. A woman in his room, especially a woman who looked like she had been plucked from a church pew in Philadelphia, was the last thing he expected. Eleanor's mouth was dry. She should scream, she should run, she should do something, anything, other than stand there like a startled deer, but her feet seemed to have taken root in the floorboards. He broke the silence. A slow, rough-edged smile spread across his face, transforming his hard features. It was a smile that did not come easily, she could tell, but it reached his eyes, making them crinkle at the corners. His voice, when it came, was low and gravelly, a sound like stones tumbling in a dry creek bed. He said he guessed heaven must have sent her to him. For a moment, Eleanor Vance thought her heart had stopped beating altogether. The man's words, spoken in that low, rumbling voice, hung in the air between them, thick with an amusement that only deepened her own mortification. Heaven had most certainly not sent her to him. A faulty room number and her own exhaustion had done that. She found her voice, though it came out as a stammering whisper. She was terribly sorry, she explained, her gaze fixed on a spot on the floor just past his worn boots. The woman downstairs, Mrs. Jenkins, had told her room 7, and the number on the door was so difficult to read. She had made a dreadful mistake. Luke Callahan simply nodded, his smile fading into a more neutral expression. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his broad chest, and watched as she fumbled with the handle of her trunk. He made no move to help, but he did not seem threatening either. He was just watching, observing her panic with a detached curiosity. He finally pushed himself off the doorframe. He told her room 7 was the next one down. The numbers had been mixed up for as long as he had been there. He supposed Mrs. Jenkins forgot to mention it. He picked up her trunk with an ease that was almost insulting, lifting the heavy object in one hand as if it weighed nothing at all. He carried it out into the hall and set it down before the correct door. Eleanor followed, her cheeks still burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the Texas sun. She avoided looking at him. Just as she was fitting her key into the lock of the correct door, the formidable shape of Mrs. Jenkins appeared at the top of the stairs, a lit oil lamp in her hand that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The boarding house owner took in the scene with her sharp eyes, her expression unchanging. She merely stated that she saw Eleanor had met Mr. Callahan. She hoped he had not been a bother. Her room was right next to his, she added, a simple statement of fact that made Eleanor's stomach clench. It was the only other room available. And so, Eleanor's new life in Copper Creek began not only with a profound sense of being an outsider, but with the constant, unnerving proximity of the man whose privacy she had so thoroughly invaded. Her room was a mirror of his in size and shape, though hers contained a small, neatly made bed and a rocking chair instead of a gun belt and muddy boots. The walls were painfully thin. She could hear the creak of his floorboards when he walked, the soft thud of his boots dropping to the floor at night, even the low murmur of his voice if he spoke to himself, though she could never make out the words. The schoolhouse was a squat, one-room building at the far end of town, little more than a shed against the vastness of the prairie. Inside, it smelled of dust and mice. Crude wooden benches served as desks, and a large slate blackboard, cracked in one corner, stood at the front. Her students were a collection of hardened farm boys and a few shy, sunburnt girls, ranging in age from 6 to 16. They looked at her with the same frank, assessing curiosity as the men on the street. They saw her fine, dark dress, her soft hands, and her Eastern manners. And they saw a creature who did not belong. The first days were a battle of wills. The younger children were restless, but the older boys were the true challenge. They were nearly men, their hands already calloused from farm work, their shoulders starting to broaden. They were not malicious, not exactly, but they tested her constantly. Their whispers and snickers a low current of disruption in the hot, stuffy room. They questioned her knowledge on practical matters, asking her things about cattle brands and crop rotation that she could not possibly know. Their feigned innocence a clear challenge to her authority. The sentiment of the town seemed to be concentrated in that small room. A woman, especially a delicate one from back east, was fine for teaching the little ones their letters. But what could she possibly teach these boys who were already doing a man's work? The idea was a source of open amusement. She heard the whispers when she went to the general store for supplies. The proprietor, Mr. Henderson, was polite enough, but the men gathered around the pot-bellied stove would fall silent when she entered, only to resume their low conversations. punctuated by an occasional laugh. As soon as her back was turned, her conflict with the town's prejudice was a constant, wearying thing. But her conflict with Luke Callahan was quieter, and in some ways, more unsettling. He remained a distant, silent presence. They passed in the hall, he with a brief, almost imperceptible nod, she with a hurried murmur of greeting. He seemed to embody the town's opinion of her. In his steady, quiet gaze, she was sure she saw a kind of pity, a silent assumption that she would not last. He saw her. She was certain, as naive and fragile, a hothouse flower that was bound to wither and break in the relentless Texas wind. And this, more than the open skepticism of the townspeople, grated on her nerves. It made her feel small. Her own heart was a battlefield. The fear she felt was a cold, constant companion. It was the fear of failure, the fear of the vast, empty spaces that surrounded the town, the fear of the hardness she saw in the faces of the people here. It was the deep, ingrained fear of a woman alone and unprotected in a world that was not built for her. She lay awake at night in her small, lonely room, listening to the mournful cry of the wind, and she felt an ache so profound it was a physical pain in her chest. She thought of her father, of the safe, orderly world he had built for her, a world of books and quiet reflection, and it felt 1,000 miles and 1,000 years away. But alongside the fear was a stubborn, unyielding core of determination. It was her father's voice in her head, speaking of fortitude and purpose. It was her own quiet pride, a refusal to be the weak, helpless creature they all thought her to be. She had come here to make a life for herself, to be independent, and she would not be driven away by whispers and challenging glares. She would prove to them, and to Luke Callahan, and most of all to herself, that she was stronger than they imagined. One evening, after a particularly trying day at the schoolhouse, she returned to the boarding house feeling defeated. The oldest boy, a hulking youth named Thomas, had openly defied her, refusing to read from the primer and declaring that learning from a woman was a waste of his time. The other boys had watched, waiting to see what she would do. She had held his gaze, her voice steady as she calmly told him to sit, but the encounter had left her shaken. That night, the loneliness felt particularly immense. The silence of the boarding house pressed in on her. She could hear the distant, tinny music from the saloon down the street, a sound of life and camaraderie from which she felt utterly excluded. She stood at her window, looking out into the impenetrable darkness of the prairie night. There were no lights, no signs of other life. There was only the vast, black emptiness and the sea of stars overhead, cold and impossibly far away. She turned from the window and performed a small ritual she had started since her arrival. She took out her oil lamp, the one she had brought with her from home. Its brass base was polished, its glass chimney clean. She trimmed the wick with care, filled it with oil, and lit it. A small, steady flame bloomed in the darkness, pushing back the shadows in her room. She picked up the lamp and carried it back to the window, placing it on the sill. Its light was not much against the great, overwhelming blackness of the prairie, a tiny pinprick of gold in an ocean of dark. But it was her light. It was a declaration. It was a signal to the darkness, and to herself, that she was still here. It was a small beacon of hope, a fragile but determined flame burning against the vast and lonely wilderness. She would not let the wind blow it out. The lamp on the windowsill did not change the town, but it changed the room, and in some small way, it changed Eleanor. Each morning she woke to its cold, brassy gleam in the pale light, a silent testament to the promise she had made herself the night before. She carried that small, internal flame with her to the schoolhouse, a shield against the whispers and the challenging stares of her pupils. The boys, led by the hulking Thomas, continued their campaign of minor resistance. They would scrape their benches on the floor in unison, a grating sound designed to unnerve her. They would feign ignorance of the simplest sums, staring at the cracked slate with blank faces until she felt her patience fraying to a single, thin thread. But she did not break. She met their provocations with a calm that was entirely manufactured, a stillness she learned to wear like a cloak. She would hold their gaze until they looked away. She would repeat her lessons in a steady, even voice until the very air in the room seemed to absorb the knowledge through sheer repetition. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a grudging sort of order began to take hold. They still saw her as an outsider, but they were beginning to understand that she was not a fragile one. The weather turned in late afternoon one Tuesday. The vast blue sky of the morning had been consumed by a bruised, purple darkness that rolled in from the west. The air grew heavy and still, charged with an energy that made the hairs on Eleanor's arms stand on end. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a physical force, rattling the schoolhouse's single window in its frame and sending dust devils dancing across the prairie. Then came the rain. It was not the gentle rain of the east. It was a violent, driving assault, each drop hitting the timber roof with the force of a thrown pebble. She and the children huddled inside, the lessons forgotten. The world outside the window was a gray, churning chaos. A tremendous crack of thunder shook the small building to its foundations, and one of the younger girls began to cry. Eleanor moved through the dim room, her voice a low, soothing counterpoint to the fury of the storm. It passed as quickly as it had come. The violent deluge softened to a steady drumming, and then a mere trickle. A pale, watery sunlight broke through the clouds, steaming the wet earth. When she dismissed the children, she stayed behind to tidy up. It was then that she saw it. A dark, damp patch was spreading across the ceiling boards in the far corner of the room. As she watched, a single, fat drop of water gathered, trembled, and fell, landing with a soft plink on the floor. Another followed, then another. The storm had breached her small fortress. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over her. The schoolhouse was town property. She would have to report the leak to the council, a group of stern-faced ranchers and merchants who already viewed her employment as a dubious experiment. They would take their time, debate the cost. Meanwhile, the rain would come again, the damage would worsen, and her classroom would become a damp, miserable place. She was standing on a bench, poking futilely at the damp spot with the end of a broom handle, when a shadow fell across the open doorway. She turned, startled, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Luke Callahan. He stood there, silent, his large frame filling the entrance. He had a coil of rope over one shoulder and a hammer in his hand. He did not greet her. He simply looked from her to the dark patch on the ceiling, his blue eyes taking in the situation with a quick, efficient glance. He remarked that the storm had been a bad one. Eleanor stepped down from the bench, brushing dust from her hands. She agreed that it had been. She explained about the roof, her voice sounding small and formal in the empty schoolhouse. He gave a noncommittal grunt and walked past her, his boots making a heavy, solid sound on the wooden floor. He did not ask permission. He simply went to the corner, tossed the rope onto a bench, and surveyed the damage with a critical eye. He told her the shingles were probably cracked, or the wind had lifted them. He said it was an old roof. He left without another word. Eleanor stood for a moment, confused and a little flustered. Had he come just to state the obvious? She felt a familiar prickle of annoyance. He was exactly as the town thought him to be, blunt, rough, and completely devoid of social graces. She turned her attention back to the leak, a fresh sense of discouragement settling upon her. A few minutes later, she heard a sound from outside. It was the scraping of a ladder against the outer wall. She went to the door and looked out. Luke was climbing onto the roof, the hammer now tucked into his belt. He moved with a surprising agility, his body sure and balanced. He had returned, and he had brought tools. He worked for the rest of the afternoon. Eleanor could hear the rhythmic tap-tap-tapping of his hammer above her. a steady, reassuring sound that was the complete opposite of the storm's chaos. She found herself unable to concentrate on her lesson plans. She kept glancing up at the ceiling, then toward the door. She felt a strange mix of gratitude and profound awkwardness. No one in this town had offered her a single, unsolicited act of kindness, until now, and it had come from the one person she was most wary of. When the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, golden fingers of light across the prairie, the hammering stopped. He came down the ladder, his face streaked with grime. He told her he had replaced a few split shingles and patched the worst of it. It should hold for a while, he said, but the whole roof would need replacing come spring. Eleanor did not know what to say. Thank you seemed inadequate. She offered to pay him, but he just shook his head. A quick, dismissive gesture. He did not even look at her as he gathered his tools. He was already turned to leave when she found her voice and asked him why he had helped. He paused in the doorway, his back still to her. For a long moment, he was silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost rough. He said a leaky roof is no place to learn. Then he was gone, his long strides carrying him away across the hard, packed earth. The story, as stories do in a town the size of Copper Creek, spread faster than a prairie fire. It only took one person seeing Luke's horse tied outside the schoolhouse for an entire afternoon. It only took a few speculative whispers. By the next day, the narrative had been written. Luke Callahan was spending his time with the new school teacher. He was looking after her. The looks Eleanor received in the general store were no longer just curious. They were knowing. The women of the town watched her with a new, sharp interest. Their conversations peppered with words like reputation and propriety. The gossip was a suffocating blanket. It made her feel exposed, judged. She was the minister's daughter, and the shadow of scandal, however small or imagined, was a terrifying thing. His kindness had become a source of shame, a weapon used against her by the very community she was trying to serve. She felt a hot, helpless anger, both at the town and at him for putting her in this position. One evening, Mrs. Jenkins found her sitting in the boarding house parlor, staring into a cold fireplace. The older woman was not one for sentiment, but she sat down in the chair opposite Eleanor, her knitting needles clicking in the quiet room. After a few minutes of silence, she spoke, her voice its usual dry, pragmatic tone. She told Eleanor not to pay any mind to the talk. People in a town like this, she said, had little to do but watch their neighbors. Then she looked at Eleanor, her sharp eyes seeming to see right through to the heart of her anxiety. She said that Luke Callahan was a good man, despite his rough ways. He was just a man who had forgotten how to be around people. And then, in her plain, unadorned way, Mrs. Jenkins told her the story. Luke had not always been so solitary. He had come back from the war a changed man, but he had married a local girl, a woman named Sarah. They had built their small ranch together. They had been happy. Then, a few years back, a group of drifters had passed through, looking for easy money. They had broken into the ranch house while Luke was out on a cattle drive. Sarah had been there alone. She had fought them. The drifters had been caught and hanged. Mrs. Jenkins said, but it was too late. Luke had come home to an empty house and a silence that he had been living in ever since. The story settled over Eleanor like a shroud. It explained everything. The hardness in his eyes, the wall he kept around himself, the profound and aching silence that seemed to cling to him. He was not judging her from a place of arrogance. He was a man hollowed out by grief, a soul who had suffered a wound so deep it might never heal. Luke looked at her and saw a fragile thing from another world because his own world had been shattered, and everything in it had become dangerous and untrustworthy. That night, as she placed the lamp on her windowsill, its small flame seemed different. It was no longer just a light for herself. It felt like a small, quiet answer to the immense darkness she now knew lived in the room next to hers. a flicker of warmth against a cold and abiding sorrow. The knowledge of Luke Callahan's past altered the way Eleanor saw him. When they passed in the narrow upstairs hallway, she no longer saw a rough, judgmental cowboy, but a man carrying an invisible, crushing weight. The silence that surrounded him was not one of disdain, but of profound and lasting grief. Her fear of him softened into a quiet, hesitant empathy. She still kept her distance, and the town's gossip ensured she was careful to do so. But the nature of that distance had changed. It was no longer a barrier of fear, but a respectful acknowledgement of a sorrow too deep to approach. The seasons turned with a brutal swiftness. The relentless heat of summer bled into a brief, golden autumn, and then winter descended upon the Texas Panhandle. It came not as a gentle dusting of white, but as an invading army. The sky, for days, was a flat, gray sheet of iron. The wind, once a hot and dusty breath, became a razor, sharp and cold, slicing across the plains with a keening howl that seemed to get inside the very walls of the buildings, inside a person's bones. The first great snow came overnight. Eleanor woke to a world transformed, a world of profound and blinding white. The town of Copper Creek, once defined by its shades of brown and dust, was buried. Its hard edges softened and erased under a thick, pristine blanket. The silence was absolute. The usual morning sounds, the clatter of wagons, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer, were all gone, smothered by the snow. It was beautiful, but it was a severe and isolating beauty. The prairie was no longer just empty. It was a featureless, white ocean, and the town was a tiny, marooned ship. For 2 days, life was suspended. No one traveled. The school was closed. The residents of the Silver Spur boarding house were confined to the common areas, a small, irritable collection of souls bound together by the weather. Eleanor spent most of her time in her room, reading her father's Bible and watching the snow swirl past her window. At night, the wind was a living thing, a predator prowling the edges of the town, rattling the window frames and shrieking down the chimney. On the evening of the second day, the last of the oil for the hallway lamps gave out. Mrs. Jenkins, frugal and practical, declared that everyone should remain in their rooms. Navigating the dark, unfamiliar passages was a needless risk. The boarding house, already isolated from the world, was now broken into smaller islands of solitude. Each resident was alone in their room with a single lamp and the sound of the storm. Eleanor sat in her rocking chair, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, the light from her lamp casting a small, warm circle in the encroaching darkness. The wind was relentless, a constant, physical pressure against the building. Around 9 o'clock, a particularly violent gust hit the house, and it was followed by a sound like a great, groaning sigh from the timbers of the roof. Then, her lamp, which had been burning steadily, sputtered once, twice, and died. The wick had burned down to nothing. The darkness that fell was total. It was a thick, suffocating blackness, disorienting and absolute. The only light was the faint, ghostly white square of her snow-covered window. The sound of the wind, no longer softened by the lamplight, seemed to double in volume, a chorus of menacing howls and whistles. A primitive, childlike fear crept into her heart. She was alone, in the dark, in a flimsy wooden box in the middle of a blizzard 1,000 miles from anything she had ever called home. She sat frozen for a long time, her hands gripping the arms of the rocking chair. She thought about trying to find her way downstairs to ask Mrs. Jenkins for a new wick or more oil. But the thought of navigating the pitch-black hallway and the creaking stairs was terrifying. She considered simply going to bed, pulling the covers over her head and waiting for morning. But a small, practical need overrode her fear. She needed to use the necessary room, which was at the far end of the hall. The thought of waiting until morning was unbearable. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she stood. She would be careful. She would count the doors. Hers was the second from the stairs. She would feel her way along the wall. She opened her door a crack. The hallway was a black maw, a tunnel of nothingness. The wind howled through some unseen crack, a draft of icy air snaking around the door and chilling her to the bone. Clinging to the wall, her hands sliding over the rough, unfinished planks. She began to move, her stockinged feet making no sound on the floorboards. She took slow, shuffling steps, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. One doorframe, then another. This must be it, her room. No, that was not right. Her room was the second door. She had started at her door. She was lost. The simple geography of the hallway, so familiar in the light, had become a treacherous, alien landscape. Panic began to bubble up in her chest. She took another step, her hand finding a doorknob. It felt cold and solid. This had to be it. She was sure she had not gone far enough to reach Luke Callahan's room. She turned the knob. The door was unlocked. It swung inward with a low groan. She stepped inside, expecting to feel the familiar space of her own small room. Instead, she was met with a different kind of darkness. This room was not entirely black. In the far corner, a small fire was burning in a stone hearth, its embers glowing a deep, pulsing red, casting faint, shifting shadows on the floor and walls. A man's silhouette was slumped in a chair before the fire, a bottle on the floor beside him. She froze, every muscle in her body tensing. It was him. She had done it again. She had walked, like a fool, into Luke Callahan's room, but this time was different. This time the room was dark, the hour was late, and the man was drinking. A cold, sharp spear of terror pierced through her. He did not seem to have heard her enter. He was staring into the embers, his posture one of utter dejection. The firelight caught the curve of a glass in his hand. He lifted it to his lips, his movements slow and heavy. Eleanor began to back away, trying to make her retreat as silent as her entrance. But her foot caught on the edge of a rug, and she stumbled, a small, choked gasp escaping her lips. His head turned slowly. He peered into the darkness where she stood, a black shape against the blacker hallway. He did not seem startled or angry. His movements were weary, resigned. He squinted, trying to make her out in the gloom. Then he spoke. His voice was not the low, amused drawl she remembered from their first meeting. It was thick, roughened by whiskey and something else, something that sounded like unshed tears. It was the loneliest sound she had ever heard. He said he guessed heaven must have sent her to him. The words, the same words he had spoken before, now carried a completely different weight. They were not a joke. They were a statement of bleak, heartbreaking irony. He was a man lost in a private hell, and she, an angel of pure mortification, had stumbled into it. Her terror subsided, washed away by a sudden, overwhelming wave of pity. She saw not a threat, but the raw, unguarded grief Mrs. Jenkins had described. The man in the chair was not the hard, silent cowboy from the hallway. He was the widower, the soldier, the man who had come home to an empty house. She found her voice, a whisper in the dark room. She apologized, explaining about her lamp, the darkness, her confusion. She was so sorry to have disturbed him. He was silent for a long moment. He took another slow drink from his glass. He told her it was no matter. The whole world was disturbed tonight. He gestured with his glass toward the window, where the snow was a frantic, white blur against the black pane. He told her she could not go back out there. The hall was as black as a wolf's throat. She would break her neck on the stairs. He slowly, stiffly, pushed himself to his feet. He was steady, not stumbling, but there was a deep weariness in his every motion. He went to the bed and pulled off a heavy wool blanket. He brought it to a large, padded armchair that sat near the hearth. He spread the blanket over it carefully. He told her to sit. He would take the floor. The storm would not last forever. She hesitated, her mind racing. Every rule of propriety, every fiber of her upbringing, screamed at her to flee, but where could she go in the sight of his slumped shoulders? The profound loneliness radiating from him held her in place. Leaving him now felt like an act of cruelty. She moved slowly toward the chair, her fear gone, replaced by a strange and unfamiliar calm. She sat down, and he draped another blanket over her lap. It smelled faintly of wood smoke in the cold night air. He put another log on the fire. It caught slowly. Then bright orange flames leaped up, pushing back the darkness, filling the room with a warm, flickering light and the comforting crackle of burning wood. The light danced on his face, revealing the deep lines of exhaustion and sorrow. He did not return to his chair, but sat on the floor, his back against the side of the bed, his long legs stretched out toward the hearth. He refilled his glass from the bottle. Outside, the blizzard raged, its fury a stark contrast to the quiet stillness that had fallen inside the room. This small space, with its fire and its two silent occupants, felt like the only safe harbor in a world of chaos. For a long time, he just stared into the flames. Eleanor watched him, her heart aching with a sorrow that was not her own. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and ragged. He began to tell her about his wife, Sarah. He spoke of her as if she were in the room with them, his words painting a picture of a woman with hair the color of corn silk and a laugh that could make the wildflowers grow. He did not speak of how she was taken from him. He spoke of how she had lived. He told of their first meeting at a town dance, of building their small house with their own hands, of the way she would sing while she worked. He spoke of the quiet, simple joy of their life together, a life that felt as distant now as a foreign country. Eleanor did not speak. She simply listened. She offered him the gift of her quiet, compassionate presence. She was no longer Eleanor Vance, the prim schoolteacher from the East. He was no longer Luke Callahan, the intimidating cowboy. They were just two lonely souls, huddled together by a fire, sharing a small measure of warmth against the vast, cold emptiness of the night. As he spoke, the rigid lines of his face seemed to soften. The telling was a release, a lancing of a wound that had festered in silence for too long. In her quiet attention, he found something he had forgotten existed, a place of trust, a moment of peace, and in his raw, honest grief, Eleanor found something she had not known. She was looking for a connection to this harsh and unforgiving land, a deeper understanding of the human heart, and the startling realization that for the first time since she had arrived in Texas, she was not afraid. The morning after the storm broke clear and cold, the world outside the window a pristine, silent expanse of white under a painfully blue sky. Eleanor had woken in the armchair, stiff and cold. The fire burned down to a pile of graying embers. Luke was already awake, standing by the window, a dark silhouette against the brilliant light. The room was quiet, filled with the unspoken intimacy of the night before. He turned as she stirred, his face unreadable in the morning light. He simply said that the storm had passed. She murmured her agreement, her voice thick with sleep. The awkwardness of the situation, of a woman being in a man's room at dawn, rushed back in, a hot tide of embarrassment. She stood, folding the blankets he had given her with neat, precise movements. She thanked him for the fire, for his kindness. He just gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. As she reached the door, he spoke her name, his voice low and quiet. When she turned, he was looking at her, his gaze direct and steady. He said he was sorry for her trouble, and she knew he was not talking about the lamp or the storm. As she slipped out into the still dark hallway, the door to Mrs. Jenkins' own rooms at the end of the hall opened, and the landlady emerged, a candle in her hand. The woman's sharp eyes took in the scene Eleanor stepping out of Luke Callahan's room, her hair slightly disheveled and her expression, for once, was not one of disapproval, but of something deeper, something that looked almost like pity. She said nothing, but the moment was sealed in the quiet air of the boarding house. A story had begun, and neither Eleanor nor Luke would have any say in its telling. Life in Copper Creek resumed its normal rhythms, but the ground beneath Eleanor's feet had shifted. The children in the schoolhouse seemed to watch her with a new, speculative curiosity. The glances she received in town were sharper, more assessing. Something had changed in her standing, a subtle demotion she could feel but not yet define. The catalyst for the town's simmering tensions was a man named Jedediah Morrison. Morrison owned the largest ranch in the county, a vast empire of cattle and land that dwarfed all the smaller holdings around it. He was a man of great influence, his wealth a gravitational force that bent the town's politics to his will. He was a pillar of the church, a member of the town council, and a man who was used to getting his way. For years, Morrison had been trying to acquire Luke Callahan's small ranch. Luke's property was not large, but it contained the only reliable, year-round source of water in the entire section, a deep spring-fed creek that never ran dry. Even in the worst of the summer heat, Morrison's huge herds were dependent on shallow wells and seasonal streams, and owning Luke's land would solidify his dominance over the entire region. But Luke, whose hands had built the house on that land, who had buried his wife in the soil there, refused to sell. This stubborn refusal was a constant irritation to a man like Morrison. Morrison also had designs on the school. He saw it not as a place of enlightenment, but as another asset to be controlled. He had spoken on the council about the need for a more practical curriculum, one that prepared the boys for ranch work and the girls for domestic duties. He had argued against the hiring of an Eastern teacher, claiming her education was unsuited for the realities of Texas life. Eleanor's quiet determination and independence were a direct challenge to his vision. He called a town meeting in the small, dusty room that served as the town hall. The stated purpose was to discuss the school's budget and future, but everyone knew the true agenda was Morrison himself. He stood before the assembled townsfolk, a large, imposing figure in a fine woolen coat, his voice smooth and confident. He spoke of progress, of the town's future, of the need for strong leadership and practical decisions. He lamented the state of the school, suggesting that the current teacher, while well-intentioned, lacked the necessary understanding of their community's needs. He spoke of the importance of a teacher whose moral character was beyond reproach, his words hanging in the air, a clear, though unspoken, accusation. Then, he turned his attention to the land. He spoke of a great opportunity for the town, a chance to expand, to bring in more business, but this progress, he explained, was being held back by sentimentality, by one man's refusal to see the greater good. He did not say Luke's name, but every eye in the room shifted to the back where Luke stood, his arms crossed, his face a hard, unmoving mask. A heavy silence fell over the room. No one dared to speak against Jedediah Morrison. His power was too absolute. The council members nodded in solemn agreement. The townspeople looked at their feet. It was in this silence that Eleanor stood up. Her heart was hammering so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Her hands were trembling, but her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady. She began by defending the school. She spoke of the importance of reading and arithmetic not just as practical skills, but as tools that opened up the world, that gave a person the ability to think for themselves. She argued that a child's mind was not a field to be plowed for a single, predetermined crop, but a garden to be cultivated with a variety of knowledge. Then, she turned to the matter of the land. She did not know the details of the dispute. She said, but she knew the principles of justice. She spoke of the rights of an individual to their own property, a right that was the very foundation of their country. She said that progress should not be built upon the coercion of one's neighbors. and that a community was only as strong as its commitment to protecting the rights of its weakest members. Her words fell into a stunned silence. A woman, the meek schoolteacher, had publicly defied Morrison. She had defended the town's silent, grieving outcast. The audacity of it was breathtaking. Morrison's face, for the first time, lost its placid confidence and darkened with a cold, controlled fury. Luke looked at her from the back of the room, his expression one of profound, unguarded shock. The meeting ended soon after, the mood tense and uncertain, but the damage was done. The whispers that had been circulating after the blizzard now had a new, more substantial foundation. The story was simple and damning. The schoolteacher was not just defending the lonely rancher. She was his woman. She had spent the night of the storm in his room, and now she was publicly taking his side against the most powerful man in town. Her reputation, the fragile shield of a minister's daughter, was shattered. She felt the change immediately. The mothers of her students looked at her with cold disapproval. Mr. Henderson at the general store was suddenly too busy to fill her order. She was an outcast, a woman of suspect morals, a pariah in the town she had tried so hard to serve. The loneliness she had felt upon her arrival was nothing compared to the sharp, stinging isolation she felt now. She was torn by a conflict that consumed her waking thoughts. Every instinct for self-preservation, every lesson on propriety she had ever learned, told her to distance herself from Luke Callahan, to salvage what was left of her good name. But her heart, a stubborn and treacherous organ, rebelled. She remembered the raw, vulnerable man by the fire, the quiet kindness of his grief. She knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that he was a good man, a man of quiet honor. To abandon him now would be a betrayal, not just of him, but of her own convictions. A few days after the meeting, seeking an escape from the suffocating confines of the town, she went for a walk on the open prairie. The snow had mostly melted, leaving the ground a damp, muddy brown. The air was crisp and clean. As she crested a small rise, she saw Luke in a large, circular corral near his ranch house. He was not alone. In the center of the corral was a horse, a magnificent, wild thing, its coat the color of raw honey, its mane and tail a tangled black cascade. It was a mustang, its eyes wide with fear and defiance, its body a taut bundle of muscle and nervous energy. She stopped, hidden by a small copse of mesquite trees, and watched. Luke was not trying to break the horse. He was gentling it. He stood in the center of the corral, his body relaxed, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not hold a whip. He did not shout. He spoke to the animal in a low, continuous murmur, a soothing, meaningless stream of words. The horse circled him, snorting, its ears pricked, its head held high. It was a dance of fear and patience. Luke made no move toward the horse. He simply stood, his presence a calm, unthreatening anchor in the center of the animal's panicked world. Slowly, after a long time, the horse's circles became smaller. Its snorting softened. It stopped, its flanks quivering, and watched him. Luke extended a hand, palm up, and waited. The horse took a hesitant step forward, then another. It stretched out its neck, its nostrils flaring as it smelled his hand. Finally, with a great, shuddering sigh, it touched his palm with its soft muzzle. Eleanor watched, her breath caught in her throat. She was not just watching a man tame a horse. She was seeing the very essence of Luke Callahan's soul. He was the horse, wild and scarred, mistrustful of the world that had hurt him. And he was the man, patient and gentle, knowing that trust could not be taken by force, but must be earned with a quiet and unwavering stillness. She understood, in that moment, that this man, who had been accused of bringing shame upon her, was the most honorable man she had ever known. And as he stood there, his hand resting on the wild creature's head, a bond of trust forged in the silence of the prairie, she knew that she could not, and would not, Abandon him. The uneasy peace that had settled over Copper Creek was as fragile as a skim of ice on a water trough. It lasted for a week. The wind that blew in from the plains turned dry and restless, carrying the scent of dust and distant, sun-baked earth. It was a wind that made people irritable, that set teeth on edge and frayed already thin tempers. On a Friday afternoon, this wind was particularly insistent, rattling the schoolhouse window and whipping the pages of the primers as the children recited their lessons. The air in the small room was thick with the smell of chalk dust and restless youth. Eleanor was trying to explain long division on the cracked slate, her voice raised slightly to be heard over the wind's constant moaning. The day was ending, and a tangible sense of relief was building in the room. It began not with a sound, but with a smell. A faint, acrid scent that was not the familiar smell of wood smoke from the town's chimneys. It was sharper, hungrier. Thomas, the oldest boy, was the first to notice it. His head lifting, his nostrils flaring, he looked at Eleanor, his usual insolent expression replaced by one of confusion and alarm. Then, a wisp of gray smoke, thin and ghostly, curled under the door from the small storage room at the back. Panic, for a heartbeat, threatened to seize the room. The younger children's eyes grew wide. Eleanor's own heart gave a sickening lurch, but the discipline she had fought so hard to instill held true. She clapped her hands together, the sharp sound cutting through the rising murmur of fear. Her voice was calm, louder and more authoritative than she had ever heard it. She instructed them to form a line, to leave their books, and to walk, not run, to the door. They obeyed. The months of quiet, relentless order she had imposed had forged a kind of trust. They filed out, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on her. She counted them as they passed through the door into the windy afternoon. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 12. They were all out. A wave of profound relief washed over her. She was about to follow them when a small, frightened wail came from inside. Samuel, a small, shy boy of 6, prone to hiding when scared. She turned back, her eyes scanning the now hazy room. She called his name. She found him huddled in the cloakroom, his face buried in a pile of winter coats, his small body shaking. She scooped him up, his arms wrapping around her neck in a desperate grip. By the time she reached the main door, it was no longer an escape route. The wind had found the fire in the storage room and had whipped it into a roaring, ravenous beast. A wall of orange flame and thick, black smoke blocked the entrance. The heat was a physical blow, a scorching breath that drove her back. The roof was burning. The sound was a deafening roar, punctuated by the sharp crack of splitting timbers. She turned, her mind racing, searching for another way out. The single window. She ran to it, Samuel still clinging to her, his terrified sobs muffled against her shoulder. She fumbled with the latch, but it was swollen shut, baked into place by years of sun and now the fire's intense heat. She picked up a wooden bench and slammed it against the glass. The pane shattered, a cascade of bright, tinkling shards. But the opening was small and high off the ground. Getting Samuel through would be difficult, and getting herself through after him, perhaps impossible. The smoke was a thick, choking blanket now. It clawed at her throat, filled her lungs with fire. Her eyes streamed, blinded by the acrid haze. The world dissolved into a terrifying, suffocating chaos of heat and noise and darkness. She sank to her knees, coughing, her strength failing. Samuel's small weight a heavy anchor. Through the roaring in her ears, she heard another sound, the splintering of wood, a desperate, powerful assault from the outside. A section of the wall beside the window burst inward in a shower of sparks and blackened planks. A figure appeared in the opening, a dark shape against the terrible, bright inferno. It was Luke. His face was a mask of grim determination, his eyes wild with a terror that was not for himself. He did not hesitate. He was inside in 2 long strides, the fire raging around him. He took the crying child from her arms and passed him through the broken wall to the hands of the townsmen who had gathered outside. Then he turned back for her. He lifted her as if she were a child, his arms strong and sure around her. She buried her face in his chest, her lungs screaming for air, the world spinning away into a black, roaring vortex. The last thing she remembered was the sudden, shocking rush of clean, cold air on her face as he carried her out of the inferno and laid her on the ground. When she came to, the world was a confusion of sounds and faces. The schoolhouse was a skeleton of blackened, burning timbers, a funeral pyre against the evening sky. The entire town was there, their faces illuminated by the ghastly, flickering light, Mrs. Jenkins was kneeling beside her, pressing a damp cloth to her forehead. The town doctor was leaning over her, his face grave. Then she saw the commotion near the center of the crowd. Jedediah Morrison was standing on a wagon bed, his voice booming over the crackle of the flames and the murmurs of the crowd. He was pointing a righteous, accusing finger, not at the fire, but at Luke Callahan, who stood alone, his face and clothes blackened with soot, his hands raw from breaking through the wall. Morrison's words were clear and venomous. He spoke of Luke's desperation, his refusal to sell his land. He told the crowd that a witness had seen Luke near the schoolhouse just before the smoke was spotted. It was a lie, a monstrous, opportunistic lie, but in the chaos and fear of the moment, it found fertile ground. Why would he do it? Morrison provided the motive. An act of spite, he claimed, to harm the town that had cast him out, to devalue the land around him. He painted Luke not as a hero who had just saved 2 lives, but as a bitter, dangerous arsonist. The crowd, swayed by Morrison's wealth and confidence, turned their collective gaze on Luke. The faces that had moments before been filled with awe at his bravery now hardened with suspicion and anger. The town's sheriff, a man who owed his position to Morrison's influence, stepped forward, his hand on his pistol. The raw, ugly machinery of frontier justice was beginning to turn. Eleanor tried to rise, to speak, but a wave of dizziness and a violent fit of coughing forced her back down. Her voice was gone, lost in the smoke. She could only watch, helpless, as the man who had saved her was encircled by the very people he had protected. His love for his land, his grief for his wife, were being twisted into weapons against him. She was carried back to the boarding house, the doctor insisting on quiet and rest. She lay in her bed, the sounds of the town a low, angry murmur outside her window. A meeting had been called, a trial, not in a proper courthouse, but in the town hall, with Morrison as the chief accuser and the frightened, angry townspeople as the jury. Mrs. Jenkins sat by her bed, her face a grim mask, and told her what was happening. Luke was being held in the small room that served as the town jail. They were talking about a rope. The injustice of it was a fire in her own blood, more potent than the smoke she had inhaled. This was not about justice. It was about greed. It was about Morrison seizing his chance to destroy the one man who stood in his way. And they were using her compromised reputation, as kindling for their accusations. She knew what she had to do. The knowledge was cold, hard, and terrifying. She had one weapon, one truth that could cut through the web of lies Morrison was weaving. But using it would mean her own ruin. It would mean standing before that entire town and sacrificing the last tattered remnants of her honor. She swung her legs out of the bed. Mrs. Jenkins tried to stop her, telling her she was too weak, that it was no use, but Eleanor pushed past her. She pulled on her dress over her nightgown, her fingers clumsy and trembling. She did not look in the mirror. She knew what she would see: a woman with a soot-stained face, wild hair, and eyes burning with a desperate, righteous fury. She walked out of the boarding house and down the main street toward the town hall. The night was cold, the stars brilliant in a sky no longer hazed by smoke. People turned to stare as she passed, a ghost risen from the ashes. She pushed open the doors to the hall and stepped inside. The room was packed, the air thick with the smell of sweat and anger. Morrison was speaking, his voice resonating with false piety. Luke stood before him, flanked by the sheriff and one of his deputies, his face bruised, his expression one of stoic, weary resignation. He looked up as she entered, and his eyes widened in disbelief. Eleanor walked to the front of the room, every eye upon her. She stopped before Morrison, her small, trembling figure a stark contrast to his looming presence. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the clear, steady tone of the schoolteacher. It was a raw, hoarse whisper, each word an effort that scraped her throat, but it carried to every corner of the silent, stunned room. She told them they were accusing the wrong man. She told them Luke Callahan was a hero. Then, taking a deep breath, she looked not at Morrison, but at the faces of the townspeople, the women who had whispered about her, the men who had judged her. She told them the truth. She told them about the night of the blizzard. She told them how her lamp had gone out, how she had been lost and terrified in the darkness, and how she had mistakenly stumbled into his room. She did not spare herself. She described her fear, and how it had vanished when she saw not a threat, but a man drowning in a grief so profound it had silenced him for years. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, fueled by a conviction that burned away her fear and her shame. She told them, "You speak of this man's character. Let me tell you of his character. He is a man who, finding a frightened woman in his room in the middle of the night, gave her his fire and his blanket and asked for nothing in return. He is a man who sat on the floor and protected me from the storm. He did not threaten me. He did not harm me. He showed me a kindness and an honor that I have not seen from any of you who now stand so quick to judge him." A profound, absolute silence fell over the room. Morrison's face was a thundercloud of fury. Luke was staring at her, his hard, stoic mask broken, his eyes shining with a raw, vulnerable light she had never seen before. She had handed them her reputation, laid her honor at their feet, and in doing so, she had given him back his life. She had stood in the fire for him, and now she was standing in the ruins of her own good name, and she had never felt stronger. Eleanor's words fell into the packed room like stones into a still, deep pond, the ripples of their impact spreading through the crowd in a wave of stunned silence. The raw, unvarnished truth of her confession, delivered with the last of her strength, was more powerful than any of Jedediah Morrison's calculated lies. She had offered them her own honor as a testament to Luke's, a sacrifice so complete and selfless that it shamed the very air they breathed. The collective gaze of the town shifted from Eleanor to Luke, and finally, to Morrison. The rancher's face was a mask of livid fury. His narrative, so carefully constructed, had been demolished in a matter of moments. For the first time, the people of Copper Creek were not seeing the powerful community leader. They were seeing a bully, a man whose greed had been laid bare by the courage of a woman he had dismissed as weak. The spell was broken. A man in the crowd, one of Morrison's own ranch hands who had been offered as the witness, suddenly seemed to find his conscience. He pushed his way forward, his face pale with sweat under the lamplight. He would not look at Morrison. He looked at the sheriff, his voice stammering as he admitted he had seen nothing. He said, "Mr." Morrison had promised him a bonus to say he had seen Luke near the school. He was sorry, he mumbled, looking at his boots, but he could not stand by and let a good man hang on his lie. The confession was the final crack in Morrison's authority. The room erupted in a low murmur of anger, now directed at the man on the wagon bed, the sheriff, a man whose allegiance had always been a matter of political survival, saw the wind had changed direction. He looked from Morrison's apoplectic face to Luke's quiet dignity, and he made his choice. He stepped forward and removed the rope that had been loosely binding Luke's hands. He told him he was free to go. Morrison, his face purple with rage, began to bluster, to threaten, but no one was listening. The town had turned on him. Men who had sought his favor now looked at him with contempt. He had overplayed his hand, and in his attempt to crush one man, he had revealed his own corrupt heart to the entire community. He clambered down from the wagon, shoving his way through the crowd that now parted for him with a cold, deliberate silence, and stormed out of the hall into the darkness, a king who had lost his kingdom. Luke did not look at the departing rancher. He looked only at Eleanor. He took a step toward her, his face a complex map of emotions she could not begin to read: gratitude, disbelief, and a deep, aching sorrow. But the townsfolk, suddenly ashamed of their rush to judgment, crowded around him, clapping him on the back, offering clumsy apologies. Eleanor, her task complete, felt a wave of profound exhaustion wash over her. The smoke, the fear, and the sheer effort of her public confession had taken their toll. Mrs. Jenkins appeared at her side, her arm a firm, steady support, and guided her from the noisy room, back into the cold, clean air of the night. Luke was exonerated, a hero twice over, but the victory felt hollow. Eleanor did not see him the next day. He did not return to the boarding house. She heard he was at his ranch, seeing to his stock. The townspeople treated her with a new, deferential respect, mixed with a healthy dose of pity. She had saved an innocent man, but in their eyes, she had confirmed her own ruin. She was the woman who had spent a night in a man's room. Her moral authority as a teacher, her very standing as a respectable woman, was gone. The town council sent a letter, a brief, formal note informing her that, given the circumstances and the destruction of the schoolhouse, her services would no longer be required. She expected the news. She had known the cost when she stood up in that hall, but the reality of it was a cold, heavy weight in her chest. She had nothing. Her job was gone. Her reputation was gone. She was once again a solitary woman with no prospects and no home. It was late the following afternoon when she saw him. She was standing at her window in the boarding house, the window where her lamp had once burned, staring out at the vast, empty prairie. She saw a lone rider, a familiar figure on a dark horse, heading not toward the town, but away from it, moving steadily toward the open, unsettled west. He had a pack horse in tow, laden with his belongings. He was leaving. A panic, cold and sharp, seized her. He was leaving to save her. He was taking the scandal, the whispers, and the memory of his own grief, and he was riding away so that she might have a chance to rebuild her life. He was doing what he thought was the honorable thing, sacrificing himself for her, and it was a sacrifice she could not, would not, accept. She did not think. She ran. She flew down the narrow stairs, past a startled Mrs. Jenkins in the lobby, and out into the street. The wind whipped her hair across her face and tore at her skirts. The people on the street stopped to stare as the quiet, disgraced schoolteacher ran through the center of town like a woman possessed, her shoes kicking up clouds of dust. She did not care. She ran past the last buildings, past the blackened, skeletal remains of the schoolhouse, and out onto the open plain. The rider was a small, distant figure now, a speck against the enormous, empty horizon. She called his name, but the wind snatched the sound from her lips and flung it away. She kept running, her lungs burning, a sharp stitch in her side. The ground was uneven, her flimsy shoes no match for the rough terrain. But she did not slow. He could not leave. He could not. He must have seen her, a lone, desperate figure chasing after him. He reined in his horse, turning in the saddle to watch her approach. He waited, a statue of stillness in the vast, windy landscape. She finally reached him, stumbling to a halt, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. She stood before his horse, her hands on her knees, trying to draw air into her screaming lungs. The wind swirled around them, a constant, physical presence, pressing her dress against her legs and stinging her eyes with fine particles of dust. He dismounted slowly, his movements stiff. He stood before her, his face grim, his blue eyes filled with a deep and profound sadness. He looked at her wild hair, her heaving chest, her dust-streaked face, and a look of immense pain crossed his features. He told her she should not have come. He said he was leaving for her own good, that with him gone, the talk would die down. He said she could find another position in another town, where no one knew her story. He was trying to give her back the life she had lost, the life of respectability she had sacrificed for him. She finally found her breath and her voice. She told him he was wrong. She asked him if he truly thought that life, a life of quiet, lonely propriety, was what she wanted. He looked away from her, then out at the endless expanse of the prairie. His voice was low, a rough sound almost lost in the wind. He spoke of the night of the blizzard, the night she had stumbled into the darkness of his room, into the darkness of his life. He said she had come into his room that night, and somehow she had never left. He said her presence had filled a cold, empty space he thought would never be warm again. He said he was leaving because he could not bear to be the cause of her ruin. The raw honesty of his words was a physical blow. Tears filled her eyes, blurring the vast brown landscape around them. The wind whipped the tears from her cheeks, mingling them with the dust. She took a step closer to him, close enough to see the deep lines of sorrow etched around his eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. She looked up at him, her gaze direct and unflinching. She smiled, a small, sad smile that trembled on her lips. She told him to stop running. She said there was no room left without him. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, his stoic mask finally crumbling. The grief, the loneliness, the years of silent pain, all washed away in the face of her unwavering declaration. He had been running his entire life, from the war, from his grief, from the world. And here, in the middle of the vast, unforgiving Texas prairie, a woman was telling him to stop. She was not just offering him forgiveness or acceptance. She was offering him a home. He closed the small distance between them, and his arms went around her, pulling her against him with a desperate, shuddering force. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in the rough fabric of his shirt, breathing in the scent of horse and dust and the man himself. He was solid, real, a firm anchor in the swirling chaos of the wind and their lives. They clung to each other, two lonely, battered souls who had found shelter in each other's arms, a small, defiant island of warmth and connection in the midst of the vast, dusty, and indifferent heart of Texas. They did not ride west. They turned and walked back toward the town, leading the horses, the prairie wind at their backs pushing them toward the life they had just claimed. They walked in silence, the space between them filled not with awkwardness, but with a profound and weary peace. The great, dramatic gestures were done. The running had stopped. What was left was the quiet, uncertain, and infinitely more difficult task of building a life from the ashes. Spring arrived that year not as a gentle promise, but as a fierce, vibrant reclamation. The prairie, which had been a study in brown dust and white snow, exploded into a riot of green and 1,000 shades of wildflower color. The air, once sharp with cold or thick with heat, was now soft and smelled of damp earth and new life. It was a season of profound and relentless hope. In the center of this rebirth, a new schoolhouse was rising. It was built on the same spot as the old one, but it was stronger, its timbers cut from thicker logs, its foundation set deeper in the Texas soil. The men of the town, in a collective act of penance and renewal, had provided the labor. Jedediah Morrison was gone. His web of influence had unraveled completely after the fire, and he had sold his vast holdings to a cattle conglomerate from the east, leaving Copper Creek to find its own, more honest, center of gravity. Luke Callahan was there every day, his hammer ringing out in the clear spring air with a steady, purposeful rhythm. He was not a man for speeches or grand apologies, but his labor was a language the town understood. He was rebuilding what had been lost, both for the community and for himself. He planed the wood for the benches and desks until they were smooth as river stones. His powerful hands, which had tamed wild horses and broken through burning walls, now working with a craftsman's gentle precision. And Eleanor was there. The town council, in a humbling reversal, had come to her at the boarding house and asked her to stay. They offered her a proper contract and a small raise in salary. She accepted, not out of forgiveness, but because this small, flawed town was now her home, and its children were her responsibility. She held her classes in the church meeting hall while the school was being built, her voice a calm and steady presence in the lives that had been touched by the fire. Her life with Luke fell into a rhythm that was as natural and unforced as the changing seasons. He would walk her back to the boarding house in the evenings, their conversation a low murmur of small, everyday things, the progress on the schoolhouse, a difficult passage in a book she was reading to the older children, a new foal born on his ranch. He never spoke of the night of the blizzard again, and she never spoke of the trial. There was no need. The events had become a part of them, the bedrock upon which their quiet trust was built. Their decision to marry was made on a Sunday afternoon. They had walked out to his ranch, to the small, sturdy house he had built with his own hands. They stood on the porch, looking out at the greening pasture where the honey-colored Mustang, now gentle and trusting, grazed peacefully with the other horses. The wind was soft, carrying the scent of blue bonnets. It was Eleanor who spoke first, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She said the house needed a woman's touch. It was a simple statement, devoid of artifice. He turned to look at her, his blue eyes searching her face. He saw no fear there, no hesitation. He saw only the calm, steady woman who had faced down a mob for him, the woman who had run after him into the wind. He told her the house had needed her for a long time, and that was all. It was not a proposal born of passion or poetry. It was a simple, profound acknowledgement of a truth that had grown between them, a truth as solid and real as the land under their feet. They were married the following week. There was no ceremony in the church, no gathering of the town. A traveling minister, passing through on his circuit, performed the service. They stood on a small hill overlooking Luke's land, the same hill where a simple wooden cross marked Sarah's grave. Eleanor had placed a small bunch of wild primroses there that morning, a quiet gesture of respect and understanding. She was not replacing the woman he had lost. She was helping him build a life after the loss. Their only witnesses were the vast, silent prairie and the immense, overarching bowl of the Texas sky. The wind served as their choir, a soft whisper through the new spring grass. Luke's horse and the Mustang stood nearby, their tails swishing in the gentle breeze. Eleanor wore a simple blue dress, the color of the morning glories that grew wild along the creek bed. Luke wore a clean shirt and his best denims. The minister's words were brief and solemn, but the promises they made to each other were not in his words. They were in the way Luke's calloused hand held hers, a firm, protective grip that spoke of a vow to never let go. They were in the way Eleanor looked at him, her eyes clear and full of a love that was not blind, a love that had seen the darkness in him and was not afraid. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, Luke did not kiss her in a grand, cinematic gesture. He simply raised her hand to his lips and held it there for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers. In that quiet, reverent act, she felt the entirety of his heart, a heart she had helped mend, a heart that was now entirely hers. She had arrived in Copper Creek a minister's daughter from the East, a woman armed with books and rules and a deep-seated fear of the world's harshness. She had been the girl who mistook his room for hers, a creature of embarrassing mistakes and fragile sensibilities. But the West had burned away her fear. It had tested her, broken her, and then forged her into someone new. She was no longer a visitor. The dust of this land was under her fingernails. The wind was in her soul. She was a woman of the West, her strength found not in avoiding hardship, but in facing it, in standing for what was right even at the cost of everything she thought she was. They walked back to the small ranch house hand in hand as the sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The house was no longer just his, it was theirs. The silence within its walls was no longer the silence of grief, but the quiet peace of a shared life. They had both been lost, in their own ways, adrift in a world that had taken too much from them. And in a dusty, forgotten corner of Texas, in the most unlikely of circumstances, they had found their way home. Out here, love is not born of promises. It is built from dust, from trust, and from the courage to stay when the wind says run. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.